Hello, everybody. The headlines today, at least, are about American cities as chaotic dystopias. That, at least, is the version articulated by Donald Trump and the Republican Party. And according to the Washington Post, they are in need of occupation. I live in one of those cities. San Francisco doesn't seem to need to be occupied by me, but what do I know? Anyway, maybe Trump and the GOP have been reading a new book by my guest today, Jonathan Mahler, The Gods of New York, Egoists, Idealists, Opportunists, and the Birth of the Modern City, 1986 to 1990. Jonathan is joining us from his home in Brooklyn, New York. Jonathan, congratulations on the new book. Were things more chaotic back then in 1996? Might there have been a reason 40 years ago to occupy chaotic places like New York?
That's a matter of personal choice whether you wanted to occupy it or not. But I would say that yes. I mean, if you think about what New York was like between 1986 and 1990, if you were a law and order president looking to prove a point, you might want to be sending the National Guard into New York. The city was kind of crazy during these years I write about. It was, it was the height of the crack epidemic. It was a time of kind of rising crime, a time with a lot of racial tension, and of course, the man who has sent the troops into D.C. was just kind of coming into his own in New York during these years, and he's one of the kind of large cast of characters in my book. And it was a absolutely crazy time in the life of New York. It was also a kind of a transformative time in the life of New York, because it's really when the modern city was born, which is really the kind of story I tell in this book.
This idea of a modern city, Jonathan, the word modern is flexible or maybe plastic. When I think of New York as a modern city, I think of Mean Streets.
Yeah,
the movie made 10 years or more than 10 years in the 70s before your story starts. Right. Does every generation tend to think its previous version more chaotic, more tumultuous?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I guess maybe. I would argue with New York. I mean, you're absolutely right that that was that era, the Mean Streets era, and you could throw in some other if you want to get into kind of movie imagery.
And what was the famous?
I mean, there's the Warriors
moment about the headline about New York dropping dead.
Toward the city dropped dead. Yeah, if so basically my book is that's the story. Mean Streets, Ford the City Drop Dead, Taxi Driver, The Warriors, those movies were New York in the 1970s. That was the sort of urban dystopia, the kind of city of urban decay and urban despair. My book kind of is sort of the next chapter in the life of the city, which is the city that was kind of reborn in the 1980s and reoriented around Wall Street and finance and real estate. And that, if you're looking for movie images, that's the city of the movie Wall Street, say, or of Tom Wolfe's kind of famous Bonfire of the Vanities. So to me, I refer to it as the modern city, because that's the city we still live in today. That's a city that's dominated by Wall Street and finance and real estate.
And of course, also the city of Do the Right Thing.
Exactly. I should have mentioned Do the Right Thing.
Spike Lee's movie. We'll come to that maybe later in the conversation. You also wrote a book. Your previous book was called The Bronx is Burning, 1977, Baseball, Politics, and the Battle for the Soul of a City. So you're all too familiar with New York in the 70s as well. When it comes to the gods of New York, these egoists, idealists, opportunists, is Trump, and I don't want to just turn this into another conversation about Trump, but is he Exhibit A in your book? I'm sure you've seen the movie The Apprentice, which really captures the spirit of the time that you write about in The Gods of New York.
Yeah. He's I wouldn't quite say he's exhibit A. I mean, I very kind of deliberately used a kind of a large cast of characters. So, he's among this cast, but I mean, I would say, you know, big characters also include, and even, bigger, I would say, is Ed Koch, who was the mayor of New York during these years. Al Sharpton, who kind of becomes, a kind of a prominent rabble rousing activist during these years. Rudy Giuliani, who was the U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York. Of Spike Lee, who we were just talking about. He's a character in the book. He's a god of New York in my kind of terminology. And Larry Kramer, the founder of ACT UP, he looms large in the book as well. So it's a kind of a collection of outsized personalities who, in a way, are kind of, jockeying for power in New York.
I've always been, I won't say confused by New York, Jonathan, but confused by its significance in America. There are obviously two readings. On the one hand, it's an island completely separate from the rest of the country and really has nothing to do with it. On the other hand, it's some sort of bellwether for America, particularly in its neoliberal shift and its cast of characters like Trump and Giuliani. In your book, The Gods of New York, is this a book about New York or a book about America?
Well, it's a book about America disguised as a book about New York, I would say. It's a story about New York, but I think the story really speaks to what, how America arrived in 2025. I mean, it's the origin story of Donald Trump, who is now, the most powerful man in the world. It's also the story, as you just referenced, neoliberalism. I don't use the term in the book, but really the story I'm telling is the rise of neoliberalism in New York. The idea that that the city put its faith in private industry, in Wall Street, in deregulation, in development, in real estate development, and the same in the global economy, the new global economy that was just beginning to emerge in the 1980s. So that's the story that I'm telling in these years, and that really becomes the story of America in the decades that followed, which of course led to the rise of all the political forces we're dealing with now, including Donald Trump.
So, should I interpret that as a tragic story? Are you suggesting that this is a tragedy, that there was a moment in the 1980s where New York was something else, then it became the gods of New York? You don't use the term neoliberalism, but this capitalist pace shaped and reshaped by the money from Wall Street, and that was, or that is, a bad thing?
Yeah, I guess it depends entirely on your perspective. I mean, a lot of people, maybe not a lot of people, some people have gotten enormously wealthy in these conditions. They've worked for a lot of people. I do think that, and a lot more people have been left out. So, I think there is certainly a tragic cast to it when you think that New York has largely lost its working class population, its middle class population. It's been hollowed out. It's very difficult for working class people to make a go of it in New York. That's I think a tragic story, but I think it's also a story of the evolution of the city and the transformation of the city, and to a certain extent, I think it was inevitable. I mean, the city needed to do something. All the manufacturing, all the factories were gone. The shipping had dried up. I mean, it needed to pivot in some way.
Your colleague at the Times, David Leonhardt, has written a parallel book. There are many parallel books of this type about what he calls the death of the American dream, another New York-centric book, although less New York-centric than yours. How does the American dream fit into your Gods of America? Sorry, not Gods of America, the Gods of New York. Did the dream change? Is it an important feature in your narrative?
Well, I would say that that New York is the kind of most powerful distillation of that dream. And when I say that, I mean, New York is famously the place where immigrants came and still come, and where in generations past you could lift yourself up from nothing. I mean, one of the characters main characters in my book, Ed Koch, his father was an immigrant who came to New York early in the 20th century, literally slept on the floor of a factory, and his son went on to become the mayor of New York City. So New York has always had this the American dream was just embodied by New York's very identity. The idea of the Statue of Liberty, welcoming immigrants here. Then you have this notion of New York was if you can make it there, you'll make it anywhere, as Frank Sinatra sang, or as Tom Wolfe said, it's the place where you go to make it. It's everything is possible in New York. And so that to me is the American dream. And it's a particular kind of version of the American dream. And so in a manner of speaking, yeah, I mean, this book is, again, not overtly, because it's really a story, but it is kind of indirectly about the American dream. Yeah.
And is that dream, or at least the New York dream, is it more or less possible today in 2025 as it was in 1985 in your mind?
I would say it is less possible maybe than it's ever been. I think that we've seen, and we have a mayoral race right now that is kind of speaking to this very issue, but we've seen the income gap, the wealth gap in the city just get wider and wider. The rich have gotten richer. The poor haven't necessarily gotten poorer, but the cost of living has gone up, and even as wages have increased marginally, they haven't kept pace. And for particularly for non-college educated New Yorkers, I mean, there's very little. There's not much here for them. It's a very expensive city. So yeah, I mean, I think it's and as we're seeing now with this mayoral race again, with the rise of Zohran Mamdani, I mean, we're seeing that a lot of people here want to reset.
What about the role of real estate? I mean, Trump, before he became a virtual reality star, virtual television star, was a real estate developer. It's arguable about how successful he was. His father was a successful real estate guy.
Yeah.
It seems as if New York is now increasingly inaccessible because of the price of real estate, either rents or buying. Upper West Side, Upper East Side, downtown, they used to be very affordable. They no longer are. How central is the real estate market in your story and its changes?
I mean, it's again, it's something I talk about. It's certainly part of the narrative. I talk about the rise of Donald Trump. I talk about the kind of boom in development that took place during these years. And I would say that the story of New York, the history of New York, is kind of largely a story of real estate, because it's a tiny place, especially Manhattan. It's a tiny little island, and what happens with the land on that island is kind of everything. And the value of what you choose to do with that land is what defines the city. It becomes the city's identity. So, in the 1940s and 50s, most of that land was devoted, to rental apartments, to small manufacturing facilities and shops and restaurants. Then, what happened in the 1980s is you had a city government that was kind of desperate for development, that was desperate to kind of revive New York's failing economy, and the answer was, well, the most valuable thing in New York is its real estate, because there's so little of it. There's such a scarcity of land here. We should take greater advantage of its economic potential by encouraging people to build, to build here. So private companies to build here. And, that's how we got Trump Tower. Trump Tower was built with a massive tax break and a massive zoning waiver that allowed Trump to build that thing way bigger than it would have been allowed otherwise. So in the process, what happened is the city encouraged all this development. A lot of affordable housing got transformed into luxury condos and co-ops, and you had an affordable housing crisis. And that affordable housing crisis that begins in the 1980s has not gone away. And in many ways, it is worse now than it's ever been.
And of course, we have not just luxury housing, but luxury shopping, like Hudson Yards, which... Exactly. We did a show about this, which Mamdani and his supporters seem to be hostile to. When in your cast of characters, you've mentioned Koch a couple of times, and Giuliani, of course, but particularly Koch. Are they important in your story because they're remarkable personalities, which they both are, or because of their policies when it comes to real estate and development and investment?
I mean, certainly in Koch's case, it's both. I mean, he's the mayor of the city. He's the central, in some ways, that makes him the kind of central figure in my book. But it's his policies. It's what he did to to revive New York's economy, but that really transformed the city, that made the city what it is today. So certainly his policy choices, and again, they were also informed by what was happening in Washington at the time, which of course was the Reagan presidency and the Reagan Revolution, which was a full embrace of the free market, a full embrace of cutting taxes on high income people, on corporations, on deregulation on Wall Street. It was all about getting the money flowing. And so Koch kind of played the hand that he was dealt, I would say, and that's sort of where he went. And so he's important both because of his personality and because of these decisions he was making that were having a huge impact on the future of the city.
Is there any ideological difference between someone like Koch and someone like Giuliani, who was, of course, very much associated with Trump, destroyed himself over Trump, a Republican, although a mainstream Republican? Is there?
Yeah.
Were there let me revise the question, Jonathan. Were there ideological alternatives to what Koch and Giuliani did with New York, which somebody like Mamdani might look back and say, if only we made that choice as opposed to this choice, we'd be in a much better position now?
There weren't many. I mean, David Dinkins gets elected in 1989 with a somewhat different sense of what the city might be, but at that point the die is already cast. And I would say with Giuliani, he was, in these years, in particular, 1986 to 1989, much of this time he's serving as the U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York. So he is the chief prosecutor in the city. He is going after all of the kind of bold-faced names in New York. The hotelier Leona Helmsley, Imelda Marcos, all sorts of big Wall Street names. But Giuliani at that point really doesn't have an ideology. He's just a super ambitious prosecutor. Then in '89, he decides to run for mayor, and he needs to kind of find a political identity. And that's when we see the kind of law and order Rudy emerge. And, that's the Rudy we kind of came to know, during his mayoralty years later. So, but in terms of the, alternatives, I think it was it's a good question. And it's probably, it was probably a major failing that there wasn't really anywhere to turn. And, another reason why is that a lot of the political power in New York had once been held by the labor unions, the labor bosses, and they might have been able to encourage a kind of a countervailing force, something else, something kind of more pro-worker, something more along the lines of what Mamdani seems to be pushing toward. But by the 1980s, the labor unions in New York had lost most of their power because there were no jobs, there were no manufacturing jobs here anymore. There were no working class jobs here. So yeah, I think it wasn't like New York chose to tack right when it had the option of tacking left, but it probably should have had some more options than it did.
Jonathan, as I'm sure you know much better than I do, there's a great debate now amongst progressives about why government doesn't work, a great debate about Ezra Klein, Derek Thompson's arguments in abundance, and about how to reinvent government. In their book and in other books, we've done lots of shows on this, as a discussion of Robert Moses, I don't know what you would call him, the New York reformer, the all-powerful figure in New York who was
power brokers is what Robert Caro called him,
who was able to change the city.
Yeah.
In terms of your narrative of the late 80s in New York. Was someone like Moses missing? I mean, some people might say Mahler's right, that New York has changed, but it hasn't changed that much. Sure, there's Hudson Yards, but nothing like the way in which New York changed in the earlier part of the century.
Well, I would say a big difference here, and a very important distinction, is that Robert Moses was a public official. You know, he was the power broker, famously, and he had a huge impact on the fabric and landscape of New York. He worked for New York. He was a public official. What happened in the 80s is that the city basically stopped doing projects like the ones that Robert Moses had taken on during his era, and instead it was the private industry who took charge of the city. So, you know, bring it back to your example of Hudson Yards. That was not a project led by the city government. That was a project led by private developers. And to the extent that you know, people like Mamdani are criticizing it, it's because it was, you know, an island built for wealthy people, wealthy New Yorkers and tourists. Is that a good use of space? I mean, that's a fair question to ask, but I think that kind of speaks exactly to the kind of, you know, I won't say the argument of my book, because it's not really an argument, but to the ideas embedded in my narrative, which is that power in the city moved from the officials, the government officials, and, you know, people like Robert Moses or the labor bosses, what have you, to private individuals like Donald Trump. I mean, in the story, in my story, in my book, one of the stories I tell in the narrative is Trump's attempt to build what began as Television City. Then he renamed it Trump City. Now, the city kind of remarkably pushed back and did not approve this, but it was a very close call, and it would have dwarfed Hudson Yards. I mean, it was more than 20 blocks of a massive development with, you know, 4 of the tallest skyscrapers in the world, you know, with 10,000 underground parking spaces. It was he was very close to pulling it off. So there was a major shift in power that was happening that I do think changed the city, you know, significantly.
From Moses to Trump, you work for the New York Times, and you got a very nice piece, surprise, surprise, in the Times about revisiting New York and all its tabloid excesses. These characters who replaced Moses, Trump, Giuliani, Koch, and all the other cast of characters in your book, are they just kind of tabloid characters, Jonathan? Do they represent this shift, some sort of ontological shift in America from real government figures with power who changed the world like Moses to these Trumpian characters? Trump, of course, is more Trumpian than anyone else, who are just tabloid characters who never really do anything apart from arouse one kind of controversy or another.
Well, I would say you both are true. I think Trump was absolutely a tabloid character, and you know, the title of this book, that, you know, the gods of New York, I'm you know, it's tongue in cheek. Obviously, these are tabloid gods. These are kind of Greek gods with, you know, with New York as their Mount Olympus. And I think Trump was absolutely a tabloid figure whom everyone dismissed in the 1980s as nothing more than a tabloid figure. I mean, I repeatedly in my research came across, you know, one prediction after another from the most distinguished columnists and pundits about how, you know, Trump's 15 minutes of fame were just about over now. So he, you know, what's remarkable is that he was a fleeting cultural figure, as Wayne Barrett, you know, his famous first chronicler, called him. He was a fleeting cultural figure, a tabloid character who somehow kept, I wouldn't even say reinventing himself, because he's kind of the same person, but who somehow kept himself alive and relevant, and one day became president. And not only that, but like there's this like incredible paradox here, which is that in the 1980s, what Donald Trump became famous as the personification of greed, of excess, of wealth, of success, of money. He was all of those things. In 2016, he became the voice of the Americans who had been left out, the voice of the disaffected, the voice of the people who had, who'd been, felt that they'd been screwed over by globalization, by NAFTA, who lived in towns where there were no factory jobs, where, who objected to the wave of immigrants coming into America, who felt that they were stealing their jobs. The idea that this man, who was the tabloid symbol of money and power, had somehow transformed himself into a symbol of an icon to the disaffected and to the powerless is like a magic trick that I don't think we've ever seen in our political
culture. It's a surreal magic trick, because I don't know if New York was ever in love with Trump. Maybe he was never in love with New York. You get all these stories about how he always had a chip on his shoulder because he was from Queens and all that. But the thing that is kind of interesting, and I wonder what your book tells us about this, is that New York became, or at least Trump became, America. As you say, he appealed to many people outside New York, but the more he spoke for this underclass or these disaffected people, the less popular he became in New York. What does that tell us about the last 40-year history of America and indeed of New York?
Yeah, I mean, I think that he was, I would say that he was in New York, he was never like a beloved figure in New York, but there was a period in the 80s where he was admired. There was a sense that he was investing in the city, that, you have to remember that New York had really been like down on its luck in the 1970s. You showed that Mean Streets picture earlier. That's what New York was, right? And then Donald Trump comes along, and he's audacious, and he's got this swagger, and he is ready to kind of invest in New York and build big buildings in New York. And that made him kind of, that earned him quite a bit of respect and admiration in the media, certainly in New York, who felt like, oh, finally someone's like investing in this city. And he was audacious in a way that New York sometimes appreciates. Then I think it became clear to New Yorkers who saw him kind of transform himself, begin to sort of become a little bit of a reactionary populist in New York, taking out a full-page ad calling for the execution of the 5 black teenagers who'd been accused of raping and beating unconscious a jogger in Central Park, even though they had not yet gone on trial. There was no evidence yet connecting them to the crime. He called for their execution, and then he, of course, makes this insane series of bets on Atlantic City to build the Trump Taj Mahal, and it's all just a house of cards. And he, goes belly up, bankrupt numerous times. So to New Yorkers, I think it seems like Trump was like a failed, he was that fleeting cultural figure. He had failed. So, I think New Yorkers have a different understanding of him than maybe the rest of America, or much of the rest of America, who saw him as in The Apprentice again, as the symbol of the successful businessman, the CEO, it's a crazy disconnect. It's hard to really explain beyond the fact that I think a lot of people don't have a full appreciation for who Donald Trump was during
probably including himself. You mentioned the Central Park Five. Spike Lee's great 1989 movie, Do the Right Thing, of course, is one of the great movies about race, not just in America, but race in New York. Yeah. How central was the issue of race? You've mentioned Tawana Brawley, of course, is in your book, Al Sharpton, some of these characters, and Trump himself. How central was the issue of race, and how did that change from the 70s to the 80s, indeed, up until the current our current moment.
Yeah, I mean, race was absolutely central, and it was central for kind of a variety of reasons. I mean, one is, you'd had this economic transformation, and then you suddenly had a lot of people, including a lot of Black New Yorkers, who'd been left out of it. So you had a population that was frustrated and resentful, and felt kind of marginalized and left out. You also had a kind of a crazy series of I mean, just racist conduct by the police and the criminal justice system. There's no other way to put it. So, for instance, you had the Michael Stewart, an infamous case, a young Black art student who's arrested for spray painting graffiti in a subway station, and is delivered 45 minutes later by the police to the hospital, comatose and unconscious, and never regains consciousness. So you had a population of people in New York, Black New Yorkers, many Black New Yorkers, who felt that they'd been absolutely mistreated by the criminal justice system, who felt they'd been left out of this great, transformation of New York's economy, who felt that their neighborhoods, which were not Manhattan, though you could say Harlem, but largely, Brooklyn and the Bronx, had been completely neglected by the city, as they had been. And, and then at the same time, you had certain kind of white enclaves, also, kind of around the city, where people felt were concerned about rising crime, and they blamed the Black community. They blamed Black New York. So racial tension was it's a huge theme throughout the book, and we're by and large, I mean, we're not. We're nowhere near where we want to be as a city now, but we're certainly in a much better place than we were then. I mean, this was about as bad as it could get.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you've seen Spike Lee's current movie, Highest to Lowest. I saw it at the weekend.
I want to see it. I haven't.
It's really good. I mean, I think it's a movie that speaks of Lee's move from do the right thing to being a wealthy, famous entertainment mogul of various kinds. So are you suggesting, Jonathan, that things are a little better now when it comes to race in New York?
Yes, I do think that is true. I mean, look, Spike Lee is a good, like a Do the Right Thing is a great kind of window to see this through. But when that movie came out in 1989, and it's just a terrific movie. It's an iconic movie. It's such an important, powerful movie. That movie spoke directly to the racial climate in New York. That was what inspired Spike Lee to write it, and that is exactly what the movie was about. He insisted on shooting it on a street in Bed-Stuy, in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn. It has the feel of that street. It has, of course, the great music from Public Enemy, who was this hip hop group that was rapping about the like social conditions for Black men in America, Black people in America in that moment, and in New York in particular. And when he was about to release that movie, which you'll remember, ends, the climactic scene is a riot outside the pizzeria. And when he was about to release that movie, not one but several big movie critics and columnists were apoplectic. They were convinced that movie was going to cause riots in New York and around the country. So the notion that tells you, everything about kind of where the city was in that moment, that like a movie, I mean, and like a brilliant piece of art the notion that a lot of columnists thought that was going to like literally ignite race riots, just tells you how close to the edge New York was in that moment.
Incendiary, I guess, is the right word.
Yes.
What about when it comes to Wall Street? One of the headlines of your book is about how the bankers saved New York, kind of. Of course, you cover in the book
Right.
Black Monday, the great crash of 1987. How does Wall Street play in your narrative, Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. It's basically New York. Wall Street does save the city, sort of, because Wall Street is, it's New York. The stock market is just booming during the first half of the 1980s and into right up until 1987 with the stock market crash. I mean, really like it never has before. And that is sending, just rivers of money through the city. It's fueling the construction of skyscrapers, the opening of new restaurants, of the clothing boutique Barney's, becomes like a hot spot during these years. And so so on the one hand, Wall Street is basically providing the fertilizer to regrow New York. On the other hand, the whole economy is now kind of bending around Wall Street. It's Wall Street that's kind of it's creating all the sort of finance related industries around it. It's fueling the real estate boom and the driving up the cost of apartments. So it's all that is happening, but a whole other kind of population, which is in the event like the majority of New York doesn't work on Wall Street, doesn't work in the finance industry, doesn't have the money to buy an apartment in a new skyscraper. So they they were not saved by Wall Street or by the transformation of the city. And the idea was that they would be. Remember that was the kind of the great Reagan notion, right? That the trickle down, that wealth would trickle down, that the rising tide would lift all boats.
Well, finally, Jonathan, you've been very generous with your time. Where are we in 2025 with all this? What does your book tell us about the possibilities of New York in 2025? When someone writes the history of New York in 2025, in 2065, 40 years on, as you've done for the late 80s, what are they going to say? What are the opportunities? What is possible? Because you mentioned Mamdani. A lot of the criticism of Mamdani is that he's offering a future which is impossible, which is inconceivable, which is, some people might say that's true. Some may say that it isn't. But what does your history tell us about the New York of the second half of the 2020s?
Yeah, well, I think that whether or not Mamdani is able, assuming he gets elected, whether he's able to actually implement any of the policies he's talking about, I do think his emergence, his rise, literally out of nowhere, and he has really become quite a popular figure in New York. He is a god of New York now himself. That speaks to the fact that New York is entering a new chapter in its life. I think it's impossible to say exactly what that chapter is going to look like at this point, but I think in many ways his rise speaks to the fact that New York is at like a new tipping point now, and in many ways his rise speaks directly to the era that I write about in this book, which was really the beginning of a chapter in the life of New York. The chapter was the chapter of Wall Street and finance and real estate. That was the chapter that led New York to a place where its former mayor, Michael Bloomberg, called it a luxury product, right? That is the kind of perfect encapsulation of what that you could entitle this chapter in New York's life, the luxury product. I think that Mamdani's popularity suggests that a new chapter is beginning. I don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but it is not going to be New York as a luxury product.
Yeah, and I wonder, I mean, you wrote your 1970s book, now you've got your 1980s book. I'm guessing, Jonathan, you'll probably come out with some intervening chapters between the 80s and the 2020s. I'm sure there's a book, or many books have been, of course, written about 9/11, but who could have imagined 9/11 in 1980s? But wonderful conversation, wonderful new book, an important book that makes sense, not just of New York, but the America, not just of the 80s, but of today. So must read, Jonathan. Love to have you back on the show. Keep writing, keep thinking. We need guys like you. Thank you so much.